just like to talk a little bit about, one of the biggest things that SRI created, and that's Siri. So how does something like that start? Someone just came into you, knocked on the office door and said, "Hey, I've got this idea for speech recognition, personal assistant. Let's go for it." How does it work?
So that's another fascinating story. It's a long story because a lot of the pieces that came together to form Siri were actually started years earlier. Open agent
Yeah.
architecture, speech recognition, um, the artificial intelligence that goes into interpreting somebody's intent, inference engines, that sort of thing. And they were all sitting around slowly coalescing well before they became Siri. So, it's rare
Yeah.
that something that profound just happens. Okay, it usually is a convergence of things that have been out there for a while.
Yeah.
Specifically with Siri, that actually began with a U.S. federal government initiative, DARPA, the same organization that created the ARPANET in the late 1960s. The organization that kept changing its name back and forth between ARPA and DARPA.
Yeah.
But in around the year 2000, uh, DARPA DARPA's leadership believed that if they could equip soldiers with a tool, a productivity tool that would automate a lot of the things that just soldiers and military units needed to do, if they could take that off the table or make it much more efficient to get them done, that military unit would outperform military units that didn't have that tool.
Yeah.
So their belief in that was, and the fact that they eventually funded a 5-year, $200 million development project to create a military version of what became Siri, is the reason why that happened. And I just to segue back in time just a moment, if you look at a lot of the big innovations, be they the global positioning system, GPS, speech recognition software, the miniaturization of electronics, the ARPANET, so many of the things that have become huge in the U.S. economy began with that type of government-funded program. And in the case of Siri, that's what happened. So SRI put together a bid for that 5-year program. We had kind of the who's who of AI, and as subcontractors, we had Stanford and MIT and Berkeley and Carnegie Mellon, and players of that ilk as subcontractors. And we put in a bid to create the government version of Siri. I think in our last conversation, I used the term Radar O'Reilly on steroids. So if you think about the old MASH television show, and Radar O'Reilly was this magical administrative person who could make everything happen fast, and that was the goal. Some of it related to calendars and scheduling and all these things that can be automated if you put some effort into it. So we did that, and each year in that 5-year period, there was a final exam, and there were specific milestones and capabilities that this development effort needed to achieve. Think about them as annual final exams, and if you pass that final exam, then you got to do the next year. So it was, DARPA is a very rigorous organization. They spend a lot of money, but they're very good at making sure they get payback for it because of the rigor that they insist that you put into it. So we got about 3 years into that, and it was occurring to us that this thing is not only working, but there's some huge commercial applications for what was coming out of that. And at the time, we were all working on flip phones. And if you remember the old flip phone with 12 little buttons, basically a telephone pad, and at some point they started to hook up data networks to the telephone service. And we were all sitting there with those 12 little buttons trying to navigate data networks, and it was insane, right? So we had that. Apple had just come out with the touchscreen for the iPhone, and that was a great step forward. But a lot of the initial applications, city guides and what's the weather, and they were fairly narrow applications. So what fit well with a commercial application of what we were doing for DARPA was to come up with a system that could look across those narrow domains and pose a question and pull pieces of the answer from different sources and integrate them together. I want to, I need a restaurant, a reservation for two at a romantic restaurant for Saturday night at 8 o'clock. Well, you could go to 4 or 5 different apps. You could go to the City Guide. You could, you might be able to go to Open Table, or um, you could get pieces to the answer from different verticals. But we found a way to pull them together. We signed up partnerships with some of those verticals, and they became part of an ontology, an ecosystem that the Siri software could pulse and bring back answers, not links. So that's the way we did it. Initially, we tried to license what became Siri to the big telecom carriers. We thought this would be a very big value-added thing for them and their competition. But we could not get a deal done that had what we believed was the appropriate value for what we were bringing to the table. So we hit a point where we said, what's going to do this? Let's do this as a startup. And we went out and found a couple of venture partners who we had worked with over the decades, and we sold them. We interested them in this, and they stuck with it. We did a startup called Siri. We licensed our intellectual property into it. We hired a team. We got a seed round, then an A round, and then a B round. We created an app for the Apple Store, and 60 days after that app went out, had been released, Steve Jobs called the leadership team at Siri and invited them over to his house, and he said that he wanted to buy the company, and they said no. Our goal is not to make a lot of money. Our goal is to get this technology out there, because at that time there was no such thing as a virtual personal assistant. People didn't know what it could do for them, how it could transform either their business or their lives, and that was the motivation of the leadership team. So Jobs went away, and a month or two later he came back, and this time he had a full business plan to integrate Siri into the iPhone, and then a deal got done. So that's how it happened.